Thanks for joining me for part two. Let's take a closer look at how our Constitution organizes the three branches of the federal government and grants us our civil rights and civil liberties. The Constitution is it's a pretty short document, 9 single-spaced pages on Microsoft Word, so I urge you to read it or at least skim it. It contains a preamble and 7 articles. Those 7 articles are further broken down into sections and clauses. Some of those clauses, like the full faith and credit clause and the supremacy clause, those are really key to American society, and so we're going to discuss them in depth later. It's also really important to realize that the Constitution cannot be fully understood without the Bill of Rights. Again, that's the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. The Bill of Rights provides for state government and individual liberties, and it was hotly debated as part of the broader debates about ratifying the Constitution. And many of the amendments of the Bill of Rights were so important to the framers that they were ratified very, very closely in time to the Constitution itself. Now let's turn to the text of the Constitution, how it's organized, and what that means for our government structure. The Constitution starts with a preamble, and that is worth reading in full. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. And then after that preamble, there are 7 articles. First up is Article 1, which creates the legislative branch. Section 1 of Article 1 states very clearly that all legislative powers are vested in Congress, and that Congress is 2 houses. That is known as a bicameral legislature. Section 2 sets forth requirements for the House of Representatives, and Section 3 does the same for the Senate. Section 8, that is the really meaty part of Article 1. It sets forth the whole scope of legislative power granted by the people to Congress. The first clause in Section 8 notes that Congress must provide for the common defense and general welfare, and that's why the President cannot unilaterally declare war. The Constitution grants that particular power to Congress. The next clause, that Congress must provide for the general welfare, that seems straightforward, but it's not. Good people can disagree on what counts as providing for the general welfare of the nation. Section 8 includes other grants of congressional authority, including regulating commerce with foreign nations, as well as with the states, and with Native American tribes. The clause about regulating commerce is really important for 2 reasons. One, it sets up Congress's Commerce Clause power, which we're going to discuss later. And 2, it recognizes that the states and Native American tribes have their own sovereignty, since the clause puts them on equal footing with foreign nations. There are other powers, including establishing post offices and promoting the sciences and the useful arts. And finally, Section 8 contains what we call the Necessary and Proper Clause. That's the part of the Constitution that authorizes Congress to make whatever laws are necessary and proper for Congress to carry out its various constitutional duties. Article 1 also contains some restrictions on congressional power. Section 9 prohibits Congress from, among other things, interfering with travel between the states, favoring one state over another, and from creating laws that are applied retroactively, which the Constitution calls ex post facto laws, or interfering with an individual's ability to petition the courts for release if they believe that the government has illegally detained them. Section 9 also prohibits us from accepting or using titles of nobility, and it contains the now infamous Emoluments Clause that prohibits accepting anything of value from a foreign state or the head of a foreign state. All right, moving on to Article 2. This creates the executive branch, and it vests all executive power, that's the power to carry out the laws, in the president. It appoints the president as the commander-in-chief, and it provides some explicit powers, such as the power to grant pardons, appoint ambassadors, make treaties, and so forth. It also sets forth the process for removing a president, impeachment, which is triggered if the president engages in high crimes and misdemeanors. The charge of high crimes and misdemeanors was understood by the framers to cover allegations of misconduct by federal officials. It could include ordinary crimes, but it was also intended to cover abuses of authority, regardless of whether or not they would be crimes if committed by somebody who was not holding a federal office. And the reason for that is because we, the people, expect our elected officials to adhere to their oaths of office. The most important part of Article 2 is the grant of authority to the president to appoint and oversee the principal officers of the executive department. So this is an important point to keep in mind because agency action affects all of us, and generally those agency policies are set from the very top. Article 3 of the Constitution creates the U.S. Supreme Court, which is actually the only court specifically created by the Constitution. However, Article 3 grants Congress the power to create additional courts and place them basically under the Supreme Court, so they are subject to the authority of the U.S. Supreme Court. Our federal district courts and our courts of appeals, also called circuit courts or appellate courts, those were created by Congress and they fall under the Supreme Court. Article 3 also sets forth the scope of the Supreme Court's authority. So the Supreme Court has the ultimate say when it comes to cases that arise under the Constitution, cases that involve the United States as a party, as well as admiralty and maritime cases. The Constitution gives the Supreme Court both original and appellate jurisdiction, meaning that there are some cases that can be filed directly with the Supreme Court, that's pursuant to its original jurisdiction, whereas others have to work their way up through the court system from the lower courts before the Supreme Court can hear the case, and that is via its appellate jurisdiction. We're going to talk about this topic in a lot more detail later when we examine the concept of judicial review as a method of holding our government accountable to the people. Of the final 4 articles of the Constitution, Articles 4 and 6 are most consequential for our daily lives. Article 4 deals exclusively with the states. It contains our full faith and credit clause, basically an acknowledgement that each state must respect the laws and rulings of sister states. And it contains the privileges and immunities clause, which restrains state efforts to discriminate against the residents of other states. Article 4 also contains the Supremacy Clause, which is a clear statement that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. This article also requires all government officials, elected, appointed, or in the civil service, to take an oath or affirmation. That is essentially a non-religious oath, but they take that oath or affirmation to support the Constitution. Importantly, Article 4 prohibits religious tests for office. That's why a person can take an oath or an affirmation. The framers were not a particularly religious bunch, at least not as we understand religion today, and they did not want to limit government civil servants to any particular religious group. They wanted anybody to be able to work for our government. So after the Articles comes the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. These amendments, along with 7 others, safeguard our individual rights and liberties. So these are the amendments that are focused on liberty, individual rights, and notions of justice. During the Constitutional Convention, there was a vigorous debate over whether these rights should have been included in the Constitution itself. And what happened was the framers compromised, and the amendments that make up the Bill of Rights were proposed shortly after the Constitution went into effect, and they were all ratified within about 2 years. Federal and state agencies must comply with the Bill of Rights. It is in fact so important that I am going to devote a separate video to it. So there are currently 27 ratified amendments to the U.S. Constitution out of 33 total amendments that were sent to the states for ratification. There are other constitutional amendments that touch upon topics such as governmental authority or governmental processes and procedures. So for example, the 18th Amendment prohibited the making, transporting, and selling of alcoholic beverages anywhere in the U.S., otherwise known as prohibition. So that was the 18th Amendment. And then the 21st Amendment repealed the 18th and returned to the states the authority to regulate alcoholic beverages. So that's how the framers of the Constitution set up our government. 3 co-equal branches and respect for the rights of state governments and individuals. By dividing the government's various powers among the 3 branches, the framers of the Constitution separated these powers. And this separation of powers was intended to create a system of checks and balances so that no one branch of government can dominate the others or usurp their authority. Based on this principle of separation of powers, Congress creates the law, the president and the executive branch carry out the law, and the courts interpret the law to resolve disputes and to act as a check on congressional and executive power grabs. The doctrine of separation of powers also means that one branch of government may not exercise the authority granted to another branch by the Constitution. This means the president can't interpret the law to resolve a dispute between a company and a federal agency, because that is left to the judicial branch. And the judicial branch cannot direct federal spending. That is left to the legislative branch. The principle of separation of powers is the division of power within a sovereign government. So in this case, the U.S. federal government. But the United States operates on a second division of power as well. That second division of power is federalism. That's the division of power between 2 sovereign governments. So in this case, the federal government and each of the 50 state governments. And we are going to cover that in the next video. Before you go, I've got a couple of new resources for you, specifically the U.S. Government Manual. That is the official handbook of the U.S. government. It sets forth the current structure of our government in pretty extreme details. All right, that's all, folks. Thanks for listening, and I will see you next time to talk more about federalism.